So if you've ever made pizza at home, you know that one of the biggest issues is that most home ovens don't get hot enough. But recently I found a trick that might actually solve this issue. So already my oven runs about 20 to 30 degrees hot, which is good, at least when it comes to pizza making. But just by pressing a few buttons, I can actually calibrate it to get 35 degrees hotter. And in my experience, this actually got my oven up to 70 degrees hotter than whatever temperature I have it set to. Now this probe maxes out at 572, which is why I only have my oven set to 500. But based on that, my oven should be able to get all the way up to about 620 degrees Fahrenheit, which is right within that 600 to 625 degree range that we want for a New York style pizza. And this is something that most ovens should be able to do. And actually, I wasn't even aware of it until last week when I saw this comment on my video. So I appreciate that suggestion. But even so, the oven temperature is only one piece of the puzzle. And actually, there's something that's arguably even more important. So when I started baking pizza at home, one of the first things I did was buy a pizza stone. And as much as I don't like to say that you need certain equipment, this one is sort of an exception. To achieve a proper crust, you need to bake your pizza on top of something very hot that can retain and transfer heat well. So stone is what most pizza shops use in their oven, but it's not the only option. And in fact, I don't use a stone anymore. Instead, I use a baking steel. It actually works even better than a stone, at least in home ovens where you can't reach professional pizza oven temperatures. But despite what some people may say, a steel doesn't get hotter than a stone. What it does do though is transfer heat much more effectively. So if you think about sticking your hand into a pot of boiling water, we all know that you'd burn yourself instantly. But if you stick your hand into that same temperature air, you'll be just fine. And that's because water transfers heat much more quickly than air, in the same way that steel transfers heat much more quickly than stone. So that's exactly what we want. We want our surface to transfer heat to the bottom of the pizza as quickly as possible to give the bottom crust that nice crispiness and charring. So even though the steel is a bit more expensive, I would highly recommend it. But it actually gets even better, because the other day I was on the Baking Steel website doing some research for this video, and I noticed they had something new called the Baking Steel Pro. Hey look, they have something new called the Baking Steel Pro. Alright, so it's a little thicker than the other one. Big whoop, it's also more expensive. Ah, 16 by 16. Alright, I'm sold. Alright. So my original baking steel was only 14 by 16, which of course meant that I could only bake 14-inch pizzas. But one of the defining characteristics of a New York style pizza is its size. And even though this won't quite get us to the full 18 to 20-inch pizza, it will get us a lot closer. And just to be clear, this video isn't sponsored. I bought these both with my own money. They're just genuinely great products. I mean, just look at the difference between a pizza baked on a baking tray versus my original baking steel versus the Baking Steel Pro. I didn't even think it'd be that noticeable, but the differences are pretty clear. So with that settled, it's time to make some pizza. As always, starting with the dough. Now, one aspect of the pizza making process that I think is sort of overlooked by a lot of home cooks, myself included until I started this series, is the actual creation of the dough balls. Because it's the first step in creating an even, uniform dough, and it's something that all of my sort of online mentors discuss the importance of.
So I'm creating tension right now.
Right. And I close it up, because if you don't close it up, what happens is when it starts proofing in there, a gas bubble could form in there. So when you're opening it up, you get thin spot in the middle.
So for the life of me, I cannot figure out this whole closing off the seams thing that they do, but I don't think it really matters. I just shape it the same way that I would any other loaf of bread, by dragging it along the counter to create tension, and it seems to work out just fine. What does matter though is the container that you proof in. I mean, if you start with the dough that isn't uniform, you're never going to be able to stretch it out evenly. So those deli containers I was using before completely mess with the shape of the dough. So most pizza shops use these aluminum tins, but really you can use anything that's wide enough to let the dough expand outward. Personally, I had a couple of these cake pans, which just so happen to be similar in size to the aluminum pizza pans. But again, pretty much anything would work. So this works, this works, this works, this works, even this works. I'm a firm believer that you don't need to buy specialized equipment that only has one specific use in your kitchen. Now this is my pizza peel, which is a piece of specialized equipment that only has one specific use in my kitchen. I know, nobody's perfect. But there's a reason I bought this. I mean, you may have noticed so far that I haven't even been using a pizza peel in this series. And really, that hasn't caused any issues. But now that I do have this bigger pizza steel that can make 16-inch pizzas, I needed something that could handle that. And the cookie tray that I've been using so far just physically isn't big enough. Plus, the pizza dough does slide off of wood a lot easier than metal, so if you're gonna buy a specialized piece of equipment, a wooden pizza peel is a pretty good one. Anyways, with all that said, I think it's finally time to start stretching our dough. And I found a few videos that I think are gonna be a pretty big help. So it seems like the process basically has 4 parts to it. First, pressing out the dough, then stretching it on the table, then picking it up and tossing it back and forth to both shake off the flour and continue stretching the dough, and then finally stretching it out the rest of the way. And with that last step, there seems to be a couple different techniques. But let's start from the beginning. So we definitely want to use plenty of flour.
Press down using 4 fingers.
And by the way, this is just a half-size pizza here for practice, so I'm only gonna stretch it out to about 11 inches total.
And this hand is more of a glider, and this hand is a puller. Keeping it close and tight, and be sure that you're stretching the crust and not the middle of the dough.
Not in the middle.
That's right.
Just at the edges.
So he said stretch the crust, but not the middle of the dough. Oh yeah. It's gonna take some practice, but we're getting there. Now we gotta shake off the flour. This part I am a little nervous about.
Then I start clicking it back and forth, knocking the flour off. And it's also opening it.
Lay it on this one and swipe it over there. You're gonna do this a couple of times.
Okay, so keep it moving. All right, not too bad. Wow. Yeah, that is a lot more uniform than what we were making before. I mean, I'm sure there was some beginner's luck involved there, but I did not think it was gonna go this well for my first attempt. I think this definitely helped. I'm using semola flour, which is sort of like semolina, but a little bit finer. And I'm gonna use the same stuff to dust my pizza peel. You can see how easily that slides with the combination of the wood and the semola flour. Now, since we are trying to replicate a pizza shop here, I'm baking on the top rack of my oven. That way, the pizza will be as close to the top heating element as it would be in a commercial pizza oven. And that, in combination with the preheated baking steel, should hopefully help us to achieve the results that we're looking for. All right, that's a pretty good looking pizza. I can already tell, like, even though I am getting some grease separation, it's more of an even distribution of grease since the dough itself is more even. Got some nice charring on the bottom. This is something that I had a hard time achieving with my other baking steel, and I definitely couldn't do it with the pizza stone. So this is a great pizza, but there's still something about it that's just not quite bringing me back to those original slices that I had at Joe's. It just doesn't have that same satisfying crispness to it, and the top crust just isn't quite caramelized enough. And I know I could bake a little bit longer, but that's just gonna bring us right back to the grease issue that we were seeing before. And in fact, I did give it a try, and that's exactly what happened. And the only other thing I can really think of that we're doing differently is the flour. Joe's, along with a lot of other New York pizza shops, use a high gluten flour called All Trumps. It has a protein content of 14.2% compared to the 12.7% in my King Arthur bread flour. The problem is that it only comes in these massive 25 or 50 pound bags, so it wouldn't really make a lot of sense for me to buy that much flour. Okay, fine. Let's do this. So as I made my dough, I could immediately tell a difference. I made it using only high gluten flour, just like they do at Joe's, rather than a combination of bread flour and whole wheat flour with the bran sifted out, which is what I've been doing before based on what I learned from Scar's Pizza. So this dough is a lot softer and more extensible, which made it quite a bit easier to stretch and shape. And it also led to a subtle but noticeable improvement in texture when baked. Look at that. That is a very solid slice. One thing I would say is the top is not quite as brown as I would like it. I can tell it's definitely got more chew to it, and it's also quite a bit airier than my bread flour does. So this dough is definitely an improvement, and it does get us quite a bit closer to our authentic New York slice. But the crispiness is still lacking. And actually, after I bought this giant bag of All Trumps flour, I found out about one potential pretty big issue with it. So this flour has potassium bromate added, which improves the rise and elasticity of the dough and reduces mixing times. Which sounds great, but the problem is that bromate is known to be a carcinogen, and it's actually banned as a food additive in a lot of countries. And although the bromate should, in theory, be fully consumed during baking, I always like to use a more natural product whenever possible. Not to mention that this flour is also bleached to make it appear whiter, and it contains a bunch of other unnecessary ingredients as well. I mean, I don't even know what most of these are for. But in one of the videos I watched, I noticed that at Williamsburg Pizza, they use Caputo Americana flour, which has the same protein content as All Trumps, but it's unbromated and unbleached. And King Arthur makes a very similar flour as well, in which the only ingredient is wheat flour. So I was able to find both on Amazon, luckily in smaller packages this time, and they both worked out great. Now with all this said, bread flour is still easier to come by and a bit cheaper than this high gluten flour, so you can certainly still use it and achieve great results. But since we are going for a true New York slice in this series, I'm going to be using the high gluten flour from here on out. I may still include some portion of sifted whole wheat flour for a bit of extra flavor, but that's something I still need to figure out through some more testing. Like I said though, this dough still isn't perfect, but actually during my last bake, I noticed something very interesting about my oven, which made me realize that I might just be approaching this whole thing wrong. So since heat rises, I've always just assumed that my oven will be the hottest at the top, and so that's where I've been baking my pizza so far. I mean, after all, I'm trying to replicate a real pizza oven, and just visually that seems to be pretty close. But this isn't a pizza oven. It's a completely different size and shape, so I think I need to approach it differently. You see, like most ovens, it has both a top and a bottom heating element, but it actually seems like in my oven, most, if not all of the heat comes from this bottom element. So it's been on for about 5 minutes. Top is reading about 300 degrees Fahrenheit, where the bottom is reading about 560. So let me do some more testing. So I collected some data, testing both the ambient oven temperatures and the baking steel temperatures on each rack of my oven. And sure enough, I found that my oven actually gets the hottest on the bottom rack, with my baking steel getting a full 40 degrees hotter on the bottom rack than it does on the top. And when I baked a pizza using that rack, well, the results were interesting to say the least. All right, check this out. But I'm not mad about that. I mean, I've literally never achieved such a charred crust in a home oven. All we need to do now is just dial that back a little bit, and that's the easy part. And on top of that, it seems to have fixed a lot of the issues I was having with the browning on the crust. I'm not even really sure why it worked that way, but can't really complain too much. So we're definitely getting closer, and I think I have a couple ideas for how we can reduce this charring to the proper level. So after a lot more research and testing, I've come up with 2 best methods, which I'm gonna put head to head for one final test. The first is what I'm calling the Joe's method, because, well, it's about as similar as I could get to the actual method they use at Joe's. So looking back at our pizzamaking.com thread, Joe's bakes at a temperature of 625 degrees Fahrenheit. So I've got that part down, but here's what might solve our issue. Joe's also uses something called a pizza screen, which is basically just a vented aluminum sheet. And they're super cheap. I got this one at my local restaurant supply store for a whopping $3.75. But basically the idea is that you can bake the pizza on top of the screen to prevent direct contact with the baking surface, and therefore to prevent burning. But we don't want to prevent charring altogether. We just want to control it. So what they do at Joe's is insert the screen after about a minute or 2 of baking. That way they can still get that super hard char at the beginning, but they can also prevent the pizza from burning during the rest of the bake time. So for my take on the Joe's method, I preheat my oven to the highest temperature it'll go with my baking steel on the bottom rack. Then I bake the pizza directly on the steel for the first 2.5 minutes. Then I quickly slide the screen underneath and continue to bake for another 2.5 minutes. Now the second method is what I'm calling the home baker friendly method, because it doesn't require any additional equipment like a screen, and it doesn't require any tinkering during the baking process. So I found that if I want to bake directly on my baking steel without having to use a screen, my best bet is to bake on the second highest rack of my oven rather than on the bottom rack. And I also set my oven to 525 degrees Fahrenheit rather than 550, because I found that that helps the top crust to get a little more evenly browned. So with this method, the pizza bakes in about 5 minutes total. And like I said, it doesn't require any maintenance during the baking process, but depending on how evenly your oven heats, you may want to rotate the pizza about halfway through to ensure even charring. All right, so here's my Joe's pizza and here's my home baker version. Take a look at the crust. The Joe's method definitely led to some darker, sort of crispier bubbles, which I guess you'd expect based on the hotter steel temperature. Looking at the top crust though, it does look like the Joe's method led to a little bit more crispness there. Well, I'll first just say, I mean, these are both great pizzas. Definitely the best we've achieved so far. But if I did have to choose one, which I guess I do, I would go with the Joe's method. With our home baker dough, it did have that nice crispiness and charring to it, but the Joe's dough was even crispier and it had a lot nicer contrast on the crust. So you get these really dark charred bits from that super hot steel, but then since we move it to the screen, we can still maintain that sort of nice soft chewiness in between the charred bits. And with this one, it's just a little bit too hard all around, and it actually didn't seem to stay crispy for quite as long as the Joe's method. Again, still a great pizza, but this one's definitely the winner. So next week we're gonna tackle the sauce, which will finally be the last component of this pizza. But in the meantime, if you missed the first few episodes of this series, you can check those out right here. Otherwise, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll talk to you in the next one.